Welcome to Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com, as well as the mobile app. Lance Meadow with you. Paul Dottino will be joining me momentarily from Detroit as we get you set for preseason game number 1 tonight in Motown. It's the Giants and the Lions. In multiple ways, you can interact with us here on the program. You give us a ring, 201-939-4513. You can hit us up on Twitter, hashtag GiantsChat. And as a reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So we'll run you through some items to watch as we get set for the first preseason game, and we'll get to some phone calls a little bit later on the program. Paul, how is Detroit treating you over these last few days?
Well, Lance, I'd love to give you a weather report, except the game is inside, and that's kind of irrelevant.
Yes, well, we'll avoid your breakdown of the jet stream then, unfortunately.
But no, in all honesty, it's been in the low 80s all week. Practice was just under beautiful blue skies on Tuesday and Wednesday with the Detroit Lions. The Giants had a walkthrough yesterday. Obviously nothing today as it is game day, but we couldn't have asked for better weather. And I think the coaching staffs of both teams were very pleased at A, the field conditions, and B, the fact that the weather held up marvelously well. So they didn't have to move, over 160 something players into the field house,
which is a nice convenience under the circumstances. Plus, I think, when you can take advantage of the outside weather, which is what you're going to be dealing with for the majority of the season, it's a lot better than having to be within the confines of an indoor facility, even though the Giants obviously have a similar setup in the event that the weather doesn't cooperate. I want to start, Paul, on the injury front so we can pinpoint some players that it's highly unlikely we're going to see. And the two guys with respect to injuries, at least that occurred within the joint practices, Devery Hamilton and Gary Brightwell did not take part in the second joint practice. So I'd be very surprised if the two of them participate, as well as Evan Neal, who obviously is still in concussion protocol.
Well, of course, because of the protocol, Neal can't participate. The other guys were legally allowed to be a participant, but because of the small nicks, talking to head coach Brian Dable, he indicated to us that all of the injured guys who were going to be held out tonight would be short-term injuries. He did not suspect that anybody was going to be a significant problem down the road. And I think it's important to note that Evan Neal in the concussion protocol made the trip. And if he was in serious danger and he was in the early stages of the protocol, they wouldn't have let him on the plane. You know how it is with concussions, sure. Lance.
Yep.
So he made the trip. He got in gear. He did some stuff, calisthenics and some cardio work with the trainers on the side, was not wearing sunglasses despite the brightness that was in the sky. Those are all telltale signs when a guy is suffering serious concussion symptoms. He did not have any of that. So I think the Giants are incredibly optimistic that he'll be back sooner rather than later.
And even if he was full go and was not dealing with a concussion protocol, highly unlikely he was going to see much action to begin with, Paul, against the Detroit Lions, because normally in the first preseason game, as you could attest to, you're not going to see a lot out of the starters. This is really about the depth chart and giving those guys an opportunity and see what they could do with respect to the flow of the game. And that's really where I want to focus on, because we've been talking about it all offseason. There's a variety of positions where there's a great deal of depth, and the position that I think we should start with is wide receiver, because somehow there's got to be some separation with respect to this group, and perhaps it starts tonight depending on who makes the most of their reps. So the back end of the wide receiver core, I would put atop the list as the one position group to watch based on productivity tonight.
Well, I think that's a very significant position to watch, but I also think that the Giants' offensive line, given the fact that Neal's not going to play, you expect Andrew Thomas as a frontline starter, probably would not. You've got potentially a rookie center, right in the middle of that offensive line. You have some other offensive linemen who are dinged up. I mean, McKeithen's coming off of an injury, so, they're working him back slowly off of rehab, so he's not going to be available for you. So, when you consider these kinds of things, Hamilton got dinged up in practice the other day, so did Tyree Phillips. So the Giants are thin for this game specifically along the offensive line, in addition to trying to figure out who they've got that they can go in there and show them something. So I think those are the two positions that are most curious for me today. Obviously, Ben Bredeson is going to be a major contributor to this team, whether it be at guard or center. He's a swing guy who somewhere in some shape or form is going to fit into this puzzle piece.
And they've been mixing and matching several offensive linemen that you mentioned. But this could be a game in particular, Paul, where Shane Lemieux gets a lot of work at center, given the fact that he has shown he wants to emphasize his skill set at that position as he looks to compete for one of the backup roles. I mean, this to me is an ideal situation. Throw him right in the mix and see what he could do within a game against the Lions, who obviously they took part in joint practices over the last 2 days. But I think there's a great opportunity specifically for a guy like Shane Lemieux, who hasn't seen an overwhelming amount of work in the NFL at that position.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Lance. He's been basically the third-string center throughout the course of training camp. And I also think he'll play some guard tonight, to be honest with you. It would not surprise me if they worked him there as well, because they like the way that Bredeson and Lemieux both can be like the next Nick Gates, if you will, a guy who might be able to swing to any of those three interior positions.
And they're going to need that because, once again, if you keep 4 backup offensive linemen, you know it goes without saying, you need to have at least 3 of those guys. One guy you could get away with, Paul, I would argue, who maybe only plays one position, maybe he's your swing tackle. The other 3, they need to be interchangeable at multiple positions. So if Lemieux can make a point of emphasis that, hey, he's a reliable center in a pinch, then you have him at center and guard, and that I think makes him a lot more valuable. Because if you look at the unofficial depth chart, and Paul, we were talking about this earlier in the week, you mentioned Phillips is a little bit banged up, but Tyree Phillips, interestingly, he's listed as a backup to 3 different positions, both interior guard spots as well as tackle. So that to me is a sign that they find him to be extremely valuable in a pinch. Once again, they can mix and match him depending on how the season flows.
Well, the difference between him and the other 2 guys is that he's talking about potentially being an outside guy on the edge at tackle instead of an inside guy in the middle of the thing at center. So he's not quite in the same category, but in the way that he's versatile and has the ability to play multiple spots, yes, in that regard, he is certainly in a similar position.
Now, I brought up the wide receivers. The players that probably will get a lot of work tonight include Bryce Ford-Whedon. We'll probably see plenty of him, the undrafted rookie. Khalil Pimpleton, I would expect to get some play. Colin Johnson could be heavily involved. And then as far as the frontline guys, Paul, I think it really comes down to how much work they want to give these players. I mean, we could see Jalen Hyatt, given the fact that he's a rookie, but as far as Darius Slayton, Paris Campbell, Sterling Shepard, Isaiah Hodgins, even Cole Beasley, I'll throw out there. So those 5 guys may not see all of them, if not perhaps some of them, with respect to the breakdown tonight.
That would not surprise me, Lance. I mean, Dan Campbell told the Detroit media earlier this week, don't expect to see any of my starters. Now, Brian Daboll has not revealed what his scratch list or his inactive list is going to be, but I think common sense and logic, based on what he did last year, and also the fact that he's got some guys nicked up. He's also got other guys who he knows are going to be frontline players on this roster. Common sense tells you that it's not likely you'll see many of the starters, if any, at the beginning of this game. Hey, one other note I just wanted to follow up on yesterday's show, because there were a lot of people puzzled, and John and I were puzzled about why the Lions had started training camp before the Giants. The fact remains that the Lions actually had their first padded practice 5 days before the Giants did. The NFL regulates training camp in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that they don't necessarily have a regulation on anymore is what day you start. Now, the Lions reported to training camp, their veterans did, 3 days before the Giants, and they had their first fully padded practice 5 days before the Giants had their first padded practice. And their padded practices, Lance, and you're familiar with this from your time with Sirius NFL XM radio, that there are a number of teams in this league that when they do a padded practice, they go full bore. They will tackle. They will send guys to the ground. They will hit. It's not a thud where you just, contact the guy and back off. which is what the Giants do. They do thud practices. They don't do full board tackling. The Lions are one of the teams that does. So I hope that clarifies for some people. As of yesterday, John and I were talking about, we couldn't figure out exactly what the rules were or why the rationale was that the Lions were able to get a little bit ahead of the practice curve before the Giants. But those are the facts. They actually did have that opportunity. It was all based on their training camp scheduling, which, of course, they do have to have certain days off. They have to have certain days that they can practice in a row and then take a break. They've got certain days where they can only do non-padded practices. There are regulations, but the dates under which they started and reported are not as closely regulated as they have been in the past.
Yeah, the rules used to be that everybody reported 15 days prior to their first preseason game. That's what it was originally, but then the NFL wanted everybody to be a little bit staggered. So from what I understand, that didn't become a hardcore rule anymore. So that's why I think you see a little bit of fluctuation. But normally for all given teams, Paul, and it was the same thing for the Lions because I just looked up when their rookies reported, the rookie classes usually come in early for everybody across the board.
Correct.
It's not only the Giants or the Lions, it's everybody, all 32 teams, and then it differentiates when you bring the veterans back into the fold to determine how soon you want them in, how quickly, to your point, you get into padded practice. I think that's where there's a great deal of flexibility across the league.
Yeah, that's something that's very recent, by the way.
Sure.
And so it's all up to the individual coaches. They have a little bit of flexibility here as to what they do with those veterans and then how quickly they get them into hitting mode. And so that was one thing I wanted to clarify from yesterday. So the Lions did indeed have an early jump on the Giants. But the other thing is I asked around to some other NFL people last night, in particular, about these dual training camp sessions. And then I kind of thought back to my own experiences. The team that travels in a dual training camp session usually has a better second day as compared to their first day because of the change in environment, the travel, eating habits, the whole scheduling thing. The more I thought about it, and as these NFL people were telling me, that first day, the road training camp team is usually a bit sluggish. And quite frankly, that's what happened to the Giants this week. They had a much better day on Wednesday.
And it's understandable also when you apply that logic, Paul, to Thursday night football games during the regular season.
Sure.
Right? Road teams always at a disadvantage because Wednesday they have to travel, whereas the home team doesn't. And the home team can get maybe at least a walkthrough or two in, as opposed to, once again, the road team that is at a bigger disadvantage. So I think the parallel is the same with respect to scheduling for joint practices in training camp versus what we see during the regular season on Thursdays.
I would agree with you. And I think that, moving forward, it'll be interesting to see if Brian Daboll adapts what some other NFL coaches have done, and that is have two sets of dual practices during a training camp. Bill Belichick with the Patriots has been doing that for several years, and Daboll is a Belichick disciple. Last year, he had one practice day with the Jets. This year, the travel to Detroit with 2 practice days. You have to wonder if at some point, maybe even next season, he decides he wants to do 2 of these with 2 different teams.
I think a lot of the rationale behind that, Paul, also is you want to make sure you're not playing that opponent perhaps during the regular season, because some teams, they shy away from getting an up-close and personal look at an opponent.
Very true.
If you're going to see them, right, a few weeks later. And I think that's what created a bit of an issue, for example, with the Jets this season. Because if you remember, the Jets came to East Rutherford last year for one day of joint practice, but they weren't playing each other during the regular season. This year they are, so I think that created a bit of a hiccup. Next year, since they're not going to be on the schedule again, that maybe creates that second opportunity to have a joint practice. And then also to add another layer to it, I think it's ideal if maybe you could get one on the road and one at your place. So this way, to your point, you adjust to the short turnaround in one circumstance, and then in another circumstance, you have it in the backyard of your own, and then you don't have to worry about getting on a plane and so forth. So it gives you maybe the best of both worlds under those circumstances.
Yeah, I would agree. It'll be interesting to see. I'm sure we're all kind of curious, especially those of us who have to make these trips.
Sure.
Being in Detroit for a full week. Well, again, the weather's been good, but there's nothing like home.
Well, you're saying Detroit is not the most happening place in the country. Is that what you're insinuating? It's okay. I think most perhaps would agree that it's not necessarily California or other areas that perhaps are a little bit more appealing to be spending an entire week.
Suffice it to say, it's not East Rutherford.
Fair enough. Well, I don't know if East Rutherford, though, would be first on most people's list, too, in fairness, Paul, who are coming from the outside of New Jersey. Okay, so let's at least be somewhat balanced with respect to our battle royale on the geography front. All right, in terms of other players to watch, because as we mentioned, there's going to be a lot of starters that are going to be spectators in this game, and I would assume that the majority of them will be under that umbrella. Then really in the secondary, for example, you're also looking at some of these back-end guys who are competing for roster spots or may mainly be special teams players. So, for example, Javarius Owens, we could see a lot of him with respect to the secondary tonight. We could see a Zion Gilbert or a Darius Williams. Bobby McCain may get a lot of work in, even though he's a polished veteran, given the fact that there's a lot of competition. I mean, those are the types of players that I'm expected to see quite active tonight in comparison to who's in front of them on the depth chart. And who knows, maybe we see a lot of Trey Hawkins, even though he's been getting work with the first team. In fairness, he was a 6th-round pick and is just getting used to life in the NFL.
I think tonight you're going to see a lot of guys try to make this team on the back end of the roster on specials. Because as we know during training camp, Lance, and you've been out there, you've seen these practices, you don't really get a lot of evidence on special teams. And so for me, I'm really curious about how does Eric Gray handle kick return duties. We've seen in recent practices, he's been handling more and more of those, not just punts anymore, but also some kickoffs. We'll see if the Giants give him a really good opportunity to return both kickoffs and punts tonight. Another thing to watch for, quite frankly, are the coverage units. Because the Giants, remember, we're talking about not a whole lot of hitting in their training camp. Well, special teams, when in your coverage units, you got guys making a lot of contact trying to get down the field to make a play and then hopefully making a tackle. So this is an opportunity for defensive players like Owens. You mentioned the rookie safety. How about rookie linebacker Deontay Johnson, who a lot of people thought was a sleeper, undrafted rookie free agent that they picked up? This guy packs a punch when he hits you. If he has any chance to make this roster at all, he's going to have to wind up being a special teams demon. So tonight, let's see if he makes a couple of big-time stops on coverage. I mean, you know, that's how guys like Mark Herzlich were able to stick around for a few years.
And I like your point about Eric Gray, because with Brightwell out, Eric Gray is listed as one of the guys that could be in the mix on both fronts because he's the backup kickoff returner. So this could be the Eric Gray game. We could see a little bit of Khalil Pimpleton, too, on punt returns as well as kickoffs. They may experiment with him, but I'm expecting a whole lot of Eric Gray, assuming, once again, Paul, the caveat is there's actually opportunities in the return game. And we know based on the new rules, there may not be an abundance of that, but you could see, and this goes back to what Thomas McGahee was talking about during the course of training camp thus far, the teams may look to just create opportunities for returns, even if it may not mimic exactly what we see in the regular season, just so that you can simulate a circumstance for one of your potential return guys.
Well, so far, and I did not check on all the late games from last night. I know Minnesota-Seattle played a late game. From what I understood, as to the midpoint of last night's action, there had not been a kickoff return unit that had instituted the new fair catch policy, where, you know, inside your 25, you can make the fair catch and the ball will come out to the 25. I had not seen that. Every team that I was aware of had actually tried to run back a kickoff, and I understand why. Because those guys who are on that unit are trying to make something out of themselves. They're trying to prove a point. They're trying to open some eyes to say, look at what I did. There's a reason you need to keep me. If you're just going to fair catch the ball and take it at the 25, you're not giving any of those players to either make a block or make a play. So I suspect you will see every one of these kickoffs today returned by both of these teams.
I'm completely with you. Plus, if you remember, we were having a conversation earlier this offseason, and I made the point that even if teams elect to implement this new rule and they just want to take the field positioning, the guys who are blocking or coming after the return man, they don't know what the return guy is going to decide to do. or if he gets under the ball and bobbles it and all of a sudden the loose ball is free on the ground. The point is, Paul, that's more of a reason why you want guys to get in the habit from a coverage standpoint and blocking up the field standpoint to get used to the fastness, the speed, and just the ebbs and flows of a play like that, because you just never know during the course of a game, even when you're anticipating it to be a fair catch, it may not turn out to be that way, depending on how the ball bounces, right? You never know.
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, a couple of times over the last couple of days, I could have sworn I saw a few kickoffs that were 5 or 6 yards deep. I mean, I've seen a bunch of highlights and clips, and guys were running them out. I mean, they weren't even they weren't even taking the touchback. They were like, no, we're coming out with it. So that just gives me the feeling that coaches around the league have basically said for the preseason, just run the thing out. Let's see if guys can make a play. Why waste our time with the new rule? I think that's the way the preseason's going to play out.
Plus, if I'm a return guy and I'm fighting for a roster spot, I would absolutely want to take it out. Even though I may gain 2 yards on the return, I want to at least take advantage of some opportunity. So I think it's most important for these bubble guys that are on the border. Few reminders before we open up the phone lines here. Giants Huddle Podcast, you can check that out on your favorite podcast platform. You can head to giants.com/podcasts for plenty of various interviews on a variety of topics. Run or Walk with Giants Legends, the Giants Foundation. It's going to host a 5K race and kids run presented by Quest. That's coming up Sunday, October 8th, 9 a.m. at MetLife Stadium. Net proceeds will benefit the Giants Foundation. All participants will receive a commemorative T-shirt. And after the race, you can stay for a post-race festival with appearances by Giants legends and a live DJ. Register now at giants.com/5K. The 2023 NFL schedule, it's officially out. Single game tickets are on sale now. Don't miss the Giants at MetLife Stadium this season. Visit giants.com/tickets to secure your seat. And you could also take your fandom to the next level with a season ticket membership. Stay connected to the club all year round, not just on game days. Memberships, they're now available for the 2023 season. To learn more about all the exclusive member benefits, you can visit giants.com/tickets. Limited inventory is available. And the Giants official connected TV streaming app is Giants TV. It brings you original video content, game highlights on demand, and direct to Big Blue fans. Giants TV, it's free. It's on Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, as well as the Giants mobile app. Lance Meadow, Paul Dottino with you here. Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. Let's open up the phone lines. Cliff is in New York, joining us here on BBKL. What's happening, Cliff? What do you got for us?
Hey, guys. Thanks for the show. I'm thinking about the wideouts and the wonderful crowded room we have. I've been thinking in terms of their blocking ability, because I'm thinking with the state of the offense the way it is, with I'm going to be patient with the offensive line, and I hope everybody else is. They've got some really significant improvement going on, and I want to give them time to get really good. And in the meantime, I'm thinking that the explosive plays are more likely to come from slants and other shorter stuff that becomes explosive when somebody can get in somebody's way down the field. And I have this vivid image of a play a couple of years ago, it might have been before the present regime, where Saquon breaks one to the outside and he's running down the field. And I'm seeing he's got a convoy of Slayton and Shepard with him, and that really impressed the heck out of me. And I don't know if the coaches have noticed that about those guys, but I know they know how to do it. I don't know if they're looking for it from Campbell and Waller and Hyatt, but it seems like, I would love to see Shep starting just because of that.
Well, but once again, it's going to depend on his health and also assuming he makes the team. I think that's the big question mark with respect to Sterling Shepard. Blocking up the field is important, but I think there's also some guys based on the routes they run and the design of the play that may not be in a position to do that too. You have to take that into consideration. A lot of it is based on the alignment of which way, for example, Saquon would run and where the receivers are on the field to get ahead to present an extra layer. And I think the game that you were referencing, I believe it was the Carolina game, Saquon's rookie year. That was the game where there was a touchdown pass thrown between Odell and Saquon Barkley. And in that game, the blocking up the field was really good. Washington, too, is another game that jumps out to me, where the blocking really stood out, guys hustling up the field.
Yeah, Lance.
Yeah, it was probably the Washington game, because I remember the other one, and it was after Odell was gone. But, I thought Sterling, was in the shadow of Odell. He was really highly rated when he was drafted, and the tragedy of his injuries for me was, I thought he was really getting a lot better at yards after the catch. I don't know if there's a stat showing that. So for me, it's not just sentimental, that I want to see him out there. I think he's still a really good player, and I think the blocking can only help a lot. I don't know if they want Waller to do any of that. I mean, when receivers block, they're not expecting them to pancake anybody, but they can do a lot down the field.
Sure, there's no doubt about it, and we appreciate the phone call. Paul, I know you were going to add something to that last statement with respect to Sterling and company.
Well, regarding Shepard, of all the receivers in the room, and I'm not trying to slight anybody, I don't think there's any doubt that Shepard shows the most gumption and the most excitement over making a run block.
Well, I think that, once again, has been well documented based on regular season games. I mean, you don't even have to notice that in practice. But, once again, I don't know, though, Paul, if they would keep a guy in particular specifically just because of his run blocking. I think that's an important aspect, don't get me wrong, but I don't know if that's necessarily the end-all, be-all deciding factor when it comes to a player, especially if, once again, there's some injury history and baggage in that department.
Oh, I agree with you. I don't think that's a deciding factor, but in terms of just the caller making a comment that, he enjoys to see the receivers making blocks downfield, there's no doubt that Shepard will give you that component.
201-939-4513 is the telephone number. David is in Michigan joining us here on BBKO. What's happening, David? What do you got for us?
Hey, guys, did I hear you criticize Detroit a little bit there a few minutes ago?
It was all in good fun.
I did offer to take you guys to dinner at a place where Sinatra ate. I just want to.
I know, David.
I just want to throw that out there.
We're kind of outside the boundaries a little bit here.
A lot of great clubs. You guys apparently stayed out around Allen Park.
Not even close to there, but that's another story.
Anyway, hey, listen, I do have a quick question. Tell me about Belton and how you think he has progressed from last year.
Well, when he had the fractured collarbone, I think that set him back, not only physically, but also emotionally, because as a rookie, when you get hurt like that, it's a big blow. It can be a hard thing to overcome. But he has come back healthy during this offseason. He has played an awful lot during training camp as the third safety. Pinnock seems to have edged ahead in terms of the guy who will start next to Xavier McKinney. So if you asked me now who the starting safeties will be, I'll go Pinnock and McKinney, and I think Belton is likely to be the third safety in the three-safety set. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that Bobby McCain is behind Belton on that depth chart.
Though McCain, once again, offers some versatility because he's been a corner and the safety. So, I mean, there's an appeal with respect to him and Nick McLeod. Dane Belton played a versatile role in college, but I think McLeod and McCain have more reps, though, where you'd be a little bit more comfortable if you had to put them in against a against a wide receiver, assuming they line up at the cornerback spot.
And Dave, I'm sure you saw Belton strip the other day at the
he looked to me like a guy who was going to be a fixture in our secondary for 5, 6, 7 years.
I don't think there's any reason to put a cap on him right now. I think he is going to be the third safety in the rotation. And again, with the sub packages that they're going to play, he should get a lot of snaps.
Okay. Hey, listen, I'm having a little hard time hearing you, but I'll listen to the rest of the podcast. And guys, next time you're in Detroit, man, let me show you around.
All right, Dave.
All right,
be
David.
Good.
Appreciate the phone call. Dane Belton, I don't think anything has lessened with respect to his outlook just because he may not be penciled in number one on the depth chart because, as I think you were hitting on, Paul, when you look at the linebackers, we don't know how much they're going to be on the field together and how often Wink is going to rely on them. So I would say probably more often than not, you're going to have an extra defensive back, and then the third safety becomes almost a starting position based on the potential volume of snaps that they could log this season. That's why it's going to be interesting when they have to cut down this roster in the secondary. Guys like Nick McLeod, Bobby McCain versus Dane Belton. Can you afford to keep all three? Or do you keep two out of the three? And then what happens with a guy like Javarius Owens, who is a 7th-round pick, given his special teams background? They may have to cut one of those individuals just because they're not going to have the luxury to keep all that volume on the back end of the defense.
Well, the guys you just mentioned, right, McLeod's a bit nicked up. So, kind of push him off to the side for just a second because you're probably not going to see him tonight. I think that McCain, he does offer some slot coverage, and I think you alluded to that before because he's played corner in this league. That's fine, but the Giants also have some other opportunities to use other names in the slot, and we know that over the last week or so, they've even experimented using Adoree Jackson in there because they really feel good about their depth at boundary corner. Well, if you're going to do that, that kind of eliminates one of the edges that McCain might have over the other safeties.
That's all dependent on, does Trey Hawkins solidify himself, Paul, right, as an outside guy? I mean, right now we're seeing that, but who's to say that come the start of the regular season, it could very well be Adoree and Deonte Banks on the outside and somebody else, like a Darnay Holmes, a Cordell Flott, or one of the other guys we've discussed. I'm with you. We've seen Adoree man the slot, but we've only seen Adoree man the slot when Trey Hawkins is in with the first team. Yes. Does that stay that way? Or is that just, okay, hey, let's throw out the young guy, see what he could do in the early stages of camp, and we're not necessarily going to present this look in the regular season? That, to me, is a TBD right now. But at least Adoree, once again, gets some exposure there because, remember, he said when he spoke to the media, Paul, the last time he was exposed to the slot was right back in high school and college. So it's been some time since they've been throwing him into the fire like that. So I would say the benefit is, if depending on how the season plays out, if you are put in a spot where you have to move him inside, you could say, okay, hey, Adoree, for the first week of training camp, remember when Trey was on the outside, you were in the inside? Okay, the communication is going to be exactly how it was in the early part of August.
Well, let me say this to you, Lance. Let's just look at the body of players that they have right now. There's no reason why, if they had to, they couldn't play Flott on the boundary. I actually like him better on the boundary than I do in the slot. But they could certainly put him out there if they needed some more depth out there. We know that McLeod is basically a boundary corner, but they've experimented with safety. Now, again, he's nicked up, but when he's healthy, and I don't believe it's a long-term injury, that's another guy who becomes boundary depth. And then the last guy who nobody ever talks about because he's on PUP, but he is coming along, we see him with the trainers on the side, is Aaron Robinson, who is a legitimate boundary corner. Now, again, I don't expect him to start the season on the 53. I think it's more likely he's PUP, but at some point during the year, they may get an extra boundary corner available to them, and that would be a real luxury.
Aaron Robinson and Wan'Dale Robinson, coincidentally, both guys with the same last name, they're both currently on the PUP list, and they both were, I want to say they were hurt around the same time last season. Maybe Robinson was a little bit earlier than Wan'Dale, but Aaron, remember, was also in and out of the lineup. I'm looking it up just to get a better idea. He was placed on IR, Paul, Aaron Robinson, on October 4th. Okay, so a little earlier than Wan'Dale Robinson, but
and a much more serious injury too. I mean, he had major stuff going on with his knee.
Sure, and if you remember, Aaron Robinson also had the appendectomy early last regular season, so that took him out of play for weeks 2 and weeks 3, which was the same time, if you remember, that Wan'Dale Robinson was initially sidelined because he hurt his knee in the opener against Tennessee. Then he came back only to then go down again against the Lions, which was in the early stages of November. So I was just trying to get an idea with respect to if it was in the same ballpark. But remember, then you don't sometimes have surgery until a few weeks later for the swelling to go down. I think Wan'Dale Robinson and Aaron Robinson, Paul, are the perfect examples of there is no identical timeline for players that have knee injuries, especially when we're dealing with the ACL or some knee ligament. You can't assume, oh, well, this guy followed this path in 2019, so therefore he's going to follow the same thing 4 or 5 years later. It doesn't work like that.
I do believe that this front office and this coaching staff looks at those guys as two talented players who, whenever they're able to get back to health, could become contributors.
Without a doubt. I mean, Aaron Robinson, as you mentioned, when he was drafted, he was looked at as an individual that could be a reliable outside corner for years to come. Unfortunately, once again, durability has not cooperated. And Wan'Dale Robinson, we saw the flashes already last season. In the Lions game, he had 100 receiving yards. We know he could do things after the catch, and he has a background as a running back in college. But once again, Do you buy him more time, Paul, by rolling him over to regular season pump, where he would then miss minimum first 4 regular season games? Or does he show you enough on the side here where you want to activate him prior to the start of the regular season? Because remember, the Giants have to say to themselves, once they take him off of PUP, God forbid he has a setback or anything like that, you cannot put him back on PUP. The insurance policy dissipates. So I think you got to look at it when you have a guy that maybe is close to coming back, but you're right up against the regular season. Just my personal opinion, if you have another option at the slot, which the Giants do, I think maybe you can afford to take the rehab process a little bit slower than if maybe there's not other options that can man that position.
Well, Joe Shane did tell CBS Sports Radio the other day that he thinks Wan'Dale Robinson is getting really close.
Yep.
Now, what does that mean? The calendar can get very fuzzy sometimes. I will say this. I know from talking to the coaching staff, they love Wan'Dale Robinson's quicks and his athleticism and his ability to explode and juke. Well, this guy's coming off a serious knee injury. It's only logical that you would want to be as cautious as you possibly can, because when he gets in the game, he's going to make those jukes. He's going to make those cuts. He's going to try to accelerate quickly. He will probably max out in terms of testing that repaired knee as soon as he gets back on the field. They're not going to be able to turn him down a notch. You know he's going to want to go full go, and that could be a little bit risky.
Well, and you could understand, given the fact that he did not play much in his first year in the NFL, and I'm sure if you ask him, he's absolutely itching to get back on the field. That's more of a reason why, Paul, the way I framed it is sometimes you have to protect the player from himself, because he may be anxious to get back on the field, but you have to explain to him, hey, if you take an extra week or two, this will help you in the long run, given the fact that, once again, we're talking about him tearing his ACL in November last year against the Detroit Lions in Week 10. I want to stay with respect to the theme of guys to watch out for today that could very well get plenty of playing time. Lance Meadow, Paul DeTito with you here, Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. We're looking ahead to the Giants-Lions matchup tonight and an opportunity for you to weigh in here moving forward. As far as the defensive line is concerned, I think a guy that could see a lot of work tonight is Jordan Riley, 7th-round pick for the Giants. Last played with Oregon. We've talked about there's many options to help stop the run this season outside of course, Dexter Lawrence with A'Shawn Robinson and Nacho coming into the fold. DJ Davidson is an option, but he's still on PUP, and Ryder Anderson is a little bit banged up. So I think all signs point, Paul, to Jordan Riley. That, to me, is a guy to watch up front that could see a lot of reps this evening.
Tackles between Lawrence and Williams, Robinson and Nacho. Well, these guys are either solidified as starters or banged up. So
yeah,
it doesn't take a lot of calculations to figure out those guys are probably going to have to clear the way to let the backup guys take those snaps tonight and try to earn their keep. I don't know, in all honesty, if you're going to keep 5 defensive tackles or only 4. Because if you wind up just keeping 4, we know who the 4 are going to be. So yes, is Riley, going to probably get a chance to show out? Well, hey, who knows? Could he be the 5th defensive tackle by the time the preseason is over? You want to be that guy, because in case they decide to keep 5, you'd like to be in under consideration. And certainly, if there is an injury to one of those 4 in front of you, you want to be the next man up. So there's everything to gain for a guy like Riley, for sure.
And it's possible that you could get him to pass through waivers and put him on the practice squad too. Whenever it comes to 7th-round picks, obviously there's a lot of chance within that selection because most teams have them probably near undrafted territory as well as draft worthy. So I don't know if necessarily you're running the risk and gambling if you did cut Jordan Riley and then you brought him back on the practice squad. It was funny because when Wink Martindale was speaking recently to the media, he was asked about some of the new faces up front, and he compared Jordan Riley, if you recall, Paul, to a California redwood, a big tree.
Yes.
So
yes,
there's no question. The man has presence. The man has size. But I think now you want to see him in action and how he can help solidify the run defense, because I think this season, if they could take Dexter Lawrence off the field a little bit more, that they want to feel they have confidence in the guys that they would plug in. And remember, A'Shawn Robinson also just came off of the PUP list. So I would argue, Paul, that may be another reason where maybe you want to keep an extra defensive interior lineman to start, given the fact that Robinson also suffered an injury midway through last season, is not that far removed in terms of the calendar year.
You know, it's always a bit of a guessing game, and it's something that confuses the puzzle when you're dealing with guys who are nicked up as you get closer and closer to cutdown day. And I want to repeat this for now the umpteenth time in the last month. There's only one cutdown. It's 90 to 53 on August 29th. That's it. So you're buying time with some of these guys because you don't have to let them go a week or two earlier.
201-939-4513 is the telephone number. Let's head back to the phone lines. Nikki is in New Jersey joining us here on BBKL. What's happening, Nikki? What do you got for us?
Hey, guys. What's going on? How you doing?
Doing all right.
Hi.
So I got a couple questions. Number one is concerning the secondary with Trey Hawkins and with Deontay. So going into next year, obviously, Adoree' not supposed to be on the roster. Now, if Trey Hawkins were to develop into an average starting corner, even as early as this year, that's already a home run by Joe Shane. But considering the fact that his contract is coming up, do you think it would be out of the question for this team to go cornerback again coming up? I know it's kind of early to be asking this question, but I was somebody
way too early.
Here,
Way too early
against Detroit. I was a big Brian Branch guy. I wasn't a huge Deontay Banks guy. And looking to get somebody in the slot is, you know, it's a revolving door, and you need a lot of bodies in there. And even what even happens if both those guys are, you know, all camp hype and you don't know what those guys are still. I'm kind of worried about that position, not just for this year, but going forward. I want to know what your guys' thoughts are on that.
Well, as Paul mentioned, Nikki, I mean, I think it's extremely premature to be having a conversation about the 2024 draft right now. I mean, we haven't even played one preseason game. I think what you were hitting on is that's why they're mixing and matching a lot of players in the slot, because I think they want to keep their options open. Adoree' has been thrown in there. We know Darnay Holmes and Cordell Flott have experience in that department. Bobby McCain, we went over, is a guy that you could throw into the slot, and he's played there in NFL regular season games. And then Nick McLeod, too. So, I mean, I just named, 5 guys that they can turn to depending on how the performance plays out or if they suffer injuries. And then next year, it depends on how the outlook of some of those guys plays out. I mean, remember, Cordell Flott was drafted in the 3rd round in 2022. So you have him on a rookie contract for another 2 years. He's got 4 years left on his rookie deal. If he could develop into a reliable guy, he could very well be the slot here moving forward. I know Darnay Holmes has an expiring rookie contract, so he's a little bit different, but Flott is not that far removed from the NFL draft here.
So I understand, I understand your point 100%. I guess my question is twofold. It doesn't sound a lot like there's anything going with Adoree'. To me, it feels like I'm kind of getting the vibe that they're just comfortable letting him walk, which me personally, I'm not, because again, you know, there would be another draft in between then, but I'm not fine myself. You know, I'm not comfortable with rocking, you know, Cordell Flott in the slot with Trey Hawkins in next year and Deontay. I still need a veteran guy back there. And that's why it's making me a bit uneasy. And even this year, I mean, Adoree' goes down again. You saw what happened to the secondary last year, and it's a very, you know, it's a revolving door, and one injury, I mean, the whole thing comes down, especially in a cover zero kind of scheme that Wink likes to run. But I understand your point. I have a couple other things I wanted to get to, but I appreciate your input.
Well,
on
I mean,
that.
the other thing real quickly, Nikki, is, I mean, that's your personal opinion, but I don't understand when you make the statement, it just seems like they want Adoree' to walk. I mean, I don't think there's any indication of what's going to happen with Adoree' beyond this season. I don't think anybody has revealed their true cards in what they're thinking.
So which is fair. I'm just kind of getting a similar vibe to my next point, which is, and again, I could prove myself wrong with this next statement. However, you know, a lot of people were expecting, okay, there was the Jones contract talks, there's the Dexter Lawrence contract talks, and Saquon was, you know, whatever was going on with him. And I was somebody the whole time who I was wondering what's going on, because Andrew Thomas is available, he's eligible for a contract extension. And that kind of came out of nowhere. We knew he was available, but there really wasn't a lot going on, at least, you know, on Twitter and everything and all the talking heads. no one was really talking about Andrew Thomas, and a lot of fans that I know and people who might be more online content creators everyone was kind of just assuming because there was nothing going on that we were hearing that they might just wait till next year to deal with Andrew Thomas.
Actually,
and that kind of came out of
to be honest, caller, I got to stop you there.
It kind of appeared to have come out of nowhere.
Go ahead, Nikki. Hold on.
I got to stop you. I got to stop you there because if you listen to Joe Shane throughout the early part of the spring and even at the combine, he had made comments that they wanted to not only get Dexter Lawrence done, but that they were also looking at Andrew Thomas. So I don't know whose papers you were reading, what talking heads you were listening to, but we talked about it on BBKL. Joe Shane made it clear that those guys were targeted guys. He mentioned, I believe, 5 different players that he wanted to look at extensions for over the course of the year. And Andrew Thomas was one of them. So I'm sorry where you got an incorrect perception.
All right, Nikki. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah. The point is Andrew Thomas's extension, the actual day it happened, you're right. There was not a lot of rumors on Twitter or rumors in the paper at that point, but we knew, anybody who paid attention to what Joe Shane was saying, we knew that was something that he had brewing in his head.
Well, plus he also referenced that they did that in Buffalo. They used to get ahead of the curve, and I referenced Deion Dawkins as a guy they treated just like Andrew Thomas. I'm not saying the money was identical, but they got ahead of it. Before the expiring rookie contract, they locked him up. So he saw how Brandon Beane operated. I don't think that was necessarily anything out of the blue. Paul, I'm looking at the clock. I believe you got to run. I don't want to hold you up in terms of your schedule unless anything has changed.
Indeed, Lance. Okay. I've got to chase down that team bus. And if I don't, I got a long walk to the stadium.
Well, I don't want you to have to. Even though you got the reps in and you know how to walk, we'll let you run. Enjoy the game tonight as we'll speak to you next week when you return to East Rutherford, New Jersey.
Stay well.
All right. That is Paul Dottino joining us from Detroit. We have a few minutes left in the program, and if you do want to weigh in, you give us a ring at 201-939-4513. And that's why we were focusing a lot on the secondary, Paul and I, because of some of the questions that have popped up over the course of the show. There is limited experience on the depth chart, and we've been emphasizing this throughout the course of the offseason. You remove Adoree Jackson from the equation. And if I just run through names here, Deonte Banks, year 1. Trey Hawkins, year 1. Neither one of those guys have played one NFL snap. Aaron Robinson, if you add up how many games he's appeared in, even though he's been in the league for a few years, you're also not going to get 3 full seasons in the league. And he's on PUP right now. So that doesn't balance the scales out in terms of experience. Radarius Williams, 6th-round pick in 2021. Here's another player that has been in and out of the lineup due to injuries. Zion Gilbert, undrafted in 2022. Cordell Flott, 3rd-round pick last year. The 2 most experienced individuals, if you're just treating corners in this conversation, Darnay Holmes, 4th-round pick in 2020. So he's now entering year 4. I would include Bobby McCain in the conversation because he has the versatility to go back and forth. But even if you look on the Giants depth chart, he's listed as a safety. So he's borderline. And then the other guy is Amani Oruwariye from the Lions. And we'll see whether or not he solidifies a roster spot. So the point is, when they finalize the 53-man roster, it could very well be Adoree Jackson and a huge youth movement. So I get the concern that if, God forbid, Adoree misses time, you don't have as many answers on the back end. But I think that's been well documented over the last 2 years in terms of the makeup of that position. I would say when they parted ways with James Bradbury, you knew that, okay, this position is going to get a lot younger, and there's not going to be nearly as much experience. And then you add on losing Julian Love in free agency, and he was also like a Bobby McCain corner/safety. You limited experience even more so with that move. So this is not a stunning development, nor do I think that it's an indication that just because they're going younger there overall, that Adoree doesn't have a future on this roster. I don't even think Joe Shane nor Brian Daboll has been asked a question since camp started, or I can't even recall going back to the offseason where they were put in a situation where they had to answer about Adoree Jackson's future. So I wouldn't read much into that if anything. I think what you're hoping to get out of this season is, by the end of 2023, that you have a better idea of what the rest of the cornerback crew looks like, which means you want these guys to play a lot this season. Aaron Robinson, you want him to get a majority of the year out on the field, because unfortunately that has not played out. And then if you feel good about Aaron Robinson, okay, now you say he's got one pretty much full season under his belt. And he was able to do X, Y, and Z within our scheme. Cordell Flott, I think this is a significant season for him. Not in terms of him losing a roster spot, but you want to see him gain reps. Remember, last year he was also another one in and out of the lineup. Forget the experience. You'd be hard-pressed to find another individual in the secondary who was drafted that has played a 14, 15-game season. That's what you want to see this season. And Rodarius Williams, if he makes the team, there's another guy. If you could get those three guys, because Darnay Holmes is on the final year of his rookie contract, so by default, his status is up in the air. But Rodarius Williams, Aaron Robinson, Cordell Flott, can those three guys, can they play the bulk of the year? And then you like to say to yourself, you're increasing your chances that one of them at least you'll feel pretty good about. So then you'll have that player, you'll have Deonte Banks, and then you could bring back Adoree'. You could go into the free agency pool, maybe bring in a proven cornerback who maybe is coming off a rookie contract, so he gained a lot of reps elsewhere, and now you're bringing him into your scheme. You at least keep your options open. But if you, at the end of this season, Adoree' has an expiring contract and you're still iffy about a lot of these young guys, Deonte Banks being the only guy who was drafted extremely high in the first round, it changes the dynamics of the secondary. So I think that goes back to one of the recent callers' points. I get the concern. I get the worry. I don't think anybody is hitting the panic button in the front office. That's why you really have to see what this season brings forward, because those three guys I would circle. I think you want to see one of those three walk away from this season feeling really good about them, and you want to see all three get a high volume of reps so that you have a sample size to operate with. A lot of these players, it's potential. It's a bit of a guessing game. He could fit in here, but I don't know if he'll be able to play X amount of games. You know, we've seen the potential of several of these players. Cordell Flott, great length, right? Okay, but, you know, length is only effective if it's on the field. Rodarius Williams, another guy with length. Got to see it on the field. And Aaron Robinson, we know he has the ability to go inside, outside, but he could very well be a mainstay on the outside. But in order to be a mainstay, you have to be able to be a reliable option weekend in and weekend out. And unfortunately, that has not come to fruition. In terms of players to watch tonight, before we wrap up here on the program, on the offensive side of the ball, Eric Gray is the player to watch. I think this could be the Eric Gray preseason between the opportunities on the ground and in the return game. I think he's going to see a lot of action. And keep in mind, even if you just look at it through the running back lens, Saquon Barkley's not playing. Matt Breida, those two veterans, there's no benefit to throw them into the mix. And Gary Brightwell is banged up. He didn't take part in the second joint practice against the Lions. So James Robinson, Jashaun Corbin, and Eric Gray. Eric Gray, I think he'll see a lot of work on special teams and in the running game. So if there's one guy on offense to circle, he is the player that I think you'll at least have some takeaways from. There's only so much that you could put into a preseason game, because you have to understand, if Dan Campbell's coming out and saying he's not going to play barely any starters, you're going to see these players go up against the second, the third, the fourth string players who are all on the bubble with respect to making the roster. Then on defense, if I had to hone in on one particular player, I referenced Jordan Riley earlier in the program, and I think he's a really good candidate. But since we're focusing on the secondary, that's where my eyes will be. And if there is one player in particular, I would say Trey Hawkins, because as I was talking about with Paul earlier, was Hawkins given opportunities just because they want to see the environment in practice and how he adjusts because they're implementing new aspects and new plays? Or is this a legitimate shot where Trey Hawkins could very well be a guy that lines up opposite Deonte Banks, and Adoree kicks into the slot. And that's going to be something that they'll implement more often than not during the season. I think the jury is still out, but you want to see him in a game action against somebody that's not wearing a Giants uniform. So Eric Gray on offense, 5th-round pick from this year. Trey Hawkins, 6th-round pick on defense. Those, I think, are the two players to watch. And obviously, there will be a lot of other individuals that are going to see plenty of action over the course of the contest. But if you wanted to pen in or pencil in two guys in particular, one on each side, those would be the two, Eric Gray and Trey Hawkins. All right, that is going to wrap up Big Blue Kickoff Live here, Friday's edition on Giants.com as well as the mobile app. You got the game tonight. We'll be back up and running on Monday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We'll recap the game, and we will start to turn our attention to another week of practice as the Giants will return home and focus on their second preseason game, which will be the end of next week. And a reminder that when it comes to Big Blue Kickoff Live, you can access it in a variety of different ways, but it is part of the Giants platforms everywhere and Giants.com/podcast. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Meadow. Stay locked to Giants.com for all the latest. Enjoy the weekend, and we'll speak to you on Monday right here on Big Blue Kickoff Live. Have a good one.